Tonight, we quietly step into a world that moves much more slowly than the one you know. There are no clocks on the wall, no screens glowing softly in the corner, no distant sounds of engines or traffic or notifications. There is only the low, warm sound of a fire burning in a stone hearth and the smell of wood smoke drifting through a small, dark room, and somewhere underneath all of that, the faintly sweet smell of bread that was baked earlier in the day and has been sitting on a wooden shelf ever since, cooling slowly in the still air. We are in a village. It is somewhere in the older parts of the world, somewhere in the long middle stretch of history, in the kind of time that is difficult to pin down precisely, but feels immediately familiar in its textures and its rhythms. The walls of the house are thick, made of stone and daub, plastered over in places where the wind used to find small gaps, and they hold the warmth inside in a way that feels almost generous, almost deliberate, as though the walls themselves understand the value of heat in a cold world. The floor is packed earth, smoothed by years of feet passing over it in the same directions, worn soft in the places where people most often stand. There is a low wooden table near the hearth and a few short stools arranged around it, and against the far wall, a shelf made of rough-cut planks resting on pegs driven into the stone, where a few clay pots sit in a quiet row, each one slightly different in shape from the last, each one made by different hands at different times. It is morning, but not early morning in the bright, cheerful sense. It is the kind of morning that is still deeply close to night, when the darkness outside the single small window has only just begun to soften at its edges, and the first gray light of the day is still more suggestion than fact. Inside the house, the only real light comes from the hearth, where a fire was banked the night before and has been breathing slowly all through the dark hours, feeding on the larger logs that were laid across it just before sleep, keeping itself alive in a low, patient way. The coals underneath are deep orange, almost red in places, and they radiate a warmth that fills the lower half of the room like water fills a bowl. The woman of the house rises before the others. She does this every morning, and there is nothing hurried or reluctant about it. It is simply the first thing that happens, the way the first thing that happens in a river is the water at the source beginning to move. She wraps a length of rough wool around her shoulders and crosses the few steps from her sleeping pallet to the hearth, and she kneels down on the earth floor and begins, very slowly and very patiently, to rebuild the fire. She uses a small iron tool to scrape the coals together into a tighter pile, encouraging them gently, and then she lays a few thin pieces of wood, kindling really, dry and light, small enough to be held in one hand, across the coals at careful angles, and she waits. She does not rush this. She has done it thousands of times, and she knows that the fire will come when it is ready, and not before. The thin wood catches slowly. There is a moment where nothing seems to be happening, where the smoke rises in thin threads from the wood without any visible flame. And then, gently, without drama, the first small tongue of orange appears at the edge of the lowest piece of wood and begins to travel. She watches it for a moment, and then she adds a slightly larger piece of wood, and then another, building the fire back up in layers, the the way a careful person adds to any good thing, a little at a time. Not much changes in these first minutes of the morning. The light in the room grows slightly warmer, slightly yellower, as the fire strengthens. The smoke rises up through the hole in the roof. There is no chimney exactly, just a gap in the thatch above the hearth, surrounded by years of blackened wood and soot, and disappears into the still air outside. From somewhere beyond the walls, there is the distant, low sound of a rooster, muffled by the thickness of the stone, and then quiet again. She hangs a pot over the fire. It is a large pot made of iron, heavy enough that she carries it with both hands, and it makes a low, dull sound when its hook settles onto the iron bar that crosses above the hearth. Inside the pot is water. She filled it the evening before from the well at the edge of the village, carrying it back in a wooden bucket held with both hands, letting it settle overnight so that any loose sediment would sink to the bottom. And this water is still cold from the night, and it will take some time to begin warming. She knows this. She sets the pot and then straightens slowly and moves to the shelf where the clay pots are lined up, and she takes down the one that holds the dried peas. It is a round-bellied pot with a cracked lip on one side, and inside it the dried peas, small gray-green things, wrinkled and hard, sit in a shallow layer at the bottom. She reaches in and takes a long handful of them and closes her hand loosely and lets them fall, one or two at a time, back into the pot, feeling their weight and their dryness, gauging the quantity by the sound they make falling and by the feel of them in her palm. She takes a good amount of them, more than a handful, enough to fill a small wooden cup, and she carries them to the pot of water and slips them in slowly, listening to them tap against the iron bottom. Then she goes to another clay pot, this one with a wide mouth and a heavy lid, where the salt is kept, and she uses 2 fingers to take a pinch of it and drops it into the water, and then another pinch, and then she steps back and looks at the fire for a moment, and then goes about her other tasks. There is always something to do in the morning. There is wood to bring in from the small covered pile outside the door, carried in armloads against the chest, the bark rough and cold and smelling of damp earth. There is yesterday's ash to be raked away from around the edges of the hearth and collected in a clay pot, where it will be saved for later uses, for cleaning, for spreading on the garden soil, for making lye for washing cloth. The ash from a wood fire is never wasted. Almost nothing is wasted. She moves through these tasks in a steady, unhurried rhythm, and the house begins to fill with the sound and light and smell of a morning in progress. The fire grows. The water in the pot begins to shift, to stir very slightly as the warmth begins to move through it, though it is still far from boiling. The gray light outside the window becomes a soft, washed blue, and then slowly, gradually, the first paleness of true dawn begins to touch the edges of the small square of visible sky. The others in the house begin to stir. There is a man, and there are 2 children, one old enough to be useful, one still small enough to be mostly in the way, in a cheerful and forgivable manner. And they come to the hearth one by one, drawn by the warmth, and they sit on the stools and hold their hands out toward the fire, without saying very much. The smaller child leans against the woman's leg while she works, and she rests her hand briefly on the child's head, smoothing the hair, and then goes on. The bread from yesterday is brought down from the shelf. It is a round, dense loaf made with rough milled grain flour that has not been sieved very finely, so it carries within it the small flecks and fragments of the outer part of the grain, which gives it a slightly gray color and a dense, chewy texture, and a flavor that is rich in a plain, simple way, not sweet, not savory exactly, just deeply itself. The crust is thick and hard from the previous day's baking. She sets it on the table and uses a short bladed knife with a wooden handle to cut it into thick slices, pressing down with the heel of her hand and drawing the blade through slowly, and the bread gives way in a way that is neither easy nor difficult. It simply takes effort, as most real things do. Each slice is roughly the thickness of 2 fingers, and the inside of the bread is dense and slightly moist still, though firmer than it was yesterday. She lays the slices on a flat stone that sits near the edge of the hearth, close enough to the heat to warm through and toast slightly on the side facing the fire, and she leaves them there while she attends to the peas, which are now beginning to show the first signs of softening in the water, the outermost layer of each little pea just beginning to loosen and go slightly translucent at the edges. Slowly, the morning advances. Outside, the village is beginning its own quiet morning. The sounds that come through the thick walls are few and muffled. A cart moving on the unpaved track somewhere nearby, its wheels finding every rut and stone. The sound of an animal, a cow perhaps, low and distant, the creak of a wooden gate, and then quiet again, and then again the small sounds of the village, going about its careful, patient life. There is no urgency in any of these sounds. They are the sounds of people doing what they always do, in the order in which they always do it, because that is the way the day works, and the day is the same as every other day, more or less, and that sameness is not a source of sadness, but a kind of comfort, the same way a well-worn path through a forest is a comfort. You know where it goes, you know the roots to step over, you know where the mud is worst after rain. The bread slices have darkened slightly on their fire-facing side. She turns them with her fingers, careful and practiced, and lets the other side warm, and the smell of warming bread fills the room in a soft way, a background smell that sits underneath everything else, underneath the smoke, underneath the earthiness of the dried peas beginning to cook. And it is a smell that belongs to this room as naturally as the stone walls and the packed earth floor. The bread absorbs the warmth from the stone and from the fire's proximity, and the moisture inside it warms too, and the slice softens slightly in the middle, while the outside firms, and the smell grows just a little richer, a little more golden. The man eats his bread standing, holding it in one hand, tearing small pieces from the edge and chewing them slowly. He drinks water from a clay cup, cold well water carried from yesterday, and says very little. The older child sits at the table and eats with both hands in the methodical, earnest way of a child who is hungry in a straightforward way and not distracted by thoughts of anything else. The younger child is given a smaller piece of bread, a heel of the loaf, soft inside, which she tears into even smaller pieces and eats one at a time, looking at the fire. Nothing dramatic is happening. This is the beginning of a day, and it is exactly like the beginning of every other day, and that is a kind of richness that is easy to overlook. The fire burns. The peas simmer very slowly in their water. The light outside the window has become the full, flat light of an overcast morning, gray-white and even, without shadow. The man leaves. He pulls on a thicker layer of clothing over what he was already wearing, a long, rough tunic, over which he wraps a darker piece of woolen cloth, and he takes up a tool from near the door, a short-handled implement with an iron blade that has been sharpened and resharpened many times. The edge of the blade, a slightly different color from the body of it, brighter where the whetstone has most recently been applied, and he goes out through the low door, ducking his head slightly, and the door closes behind him, and the sound of his footsteps fades, and then the room is quieter again. She stirs the peas. She uses a long wooden spoon, its bowl darkened and slightly roughened from years of use, and she draws it through the water in slow circles, feeling the peas resist slightly, still mostly firm, still needing more time. She adds a little more water from a bucket near the wall, careful not too much, the water level rising in the pot just slightly, and then she adds something from a small clay jar near the back of the hearth shelf, a pinch of dried herbs, rubbed between her fingers as she drops them in, releasing what little fragrance they still hold after their months of drying. They are something green and slightly bitter, perhaps some variety of thyme or sage or wild herb gathered from the hillside in summer, dried in small bunches in the rafters, crumbled and stored for winter, and they dissolve slowly into the water, tinting it very slightly, contributing a thin thread of flavor that will deepen as the cooking continues. There is a rhythm to tending a fire-cooked meal that is unlike almost any other rhythm. It is slower than breathing, slower even than walking. It operates on the time scale of wood burning and water heating and dried things softening and flavors slowly mingling, and it asks the cook to be patient in a particular way, to return again and again to the pot and give it attention, and then step away and let it work on its own, and then return again and stir and taste and add a little something and step away again. It is a relationship between the cook and the pot and the fire and the ingredients, a slow conversation that takes hours to have. She goes about other work while the peas cook. She sweeps the floor, not with a broom exactly, but with a bundle of stiff, bound grasses, worn nearly flat on one end where it has swept this floor many thousands of times, moving the ash and the crumbs and the general fine gray dust of living in a stone house with a fire toward the door and then outside. She hangs a piece of cloth from a wooden peg and spreads it flat and examines it in the gray morning light, looking for tears that need mending, running her thumb along a seam that has begun to loosen. She works with a needle made of bone and thread spun from wool, making small, even stitches that pull the seam back together with a quiet, almost invisible neatness. Outside the window, the morning continues its slow work of brightening. though the clouds hold most of the light back and diffuse it into a general pallor that makes everything look slightly flattened, slightly less distinct than it might on a clearer day. A pigeon lands on the window ledge for a moment, its head bobbing as it looks in at the room, and then it is gone again. Not much changes for a long time. The peas in the pot have softened considerably by mid-morning. The water around them has taken on a slight cloudiness, pale, yellowish green, faintly murky, as the starch from the peas begins to dissolve into it, thickening the liquid very slowly into something that is on the way to becoming more of a porridge or a thin soup, depending on how long it cooks and how much water has been added. The smell from the pot has deepened too. It is a plain smell, an honest smell, the smell of legumes cooking in water with a little salt and a little dried herb, and it is not a smell that anyone would find particularly exciting, and that is exactly the right way for it to be. It is a smell that says, something is being made, something is being prepared, something patient and ordinary is underway. She tastes it from the wooden spoon, blowing on the spoon first to cool it, then touching it to her lip before putting it all the way in her mouth. She considers this taste for a moment, standing still with the spoon in her hand, looking at the fire rather than anything in particular. Then she goes to the salt pot and takes another small pinch and drops it in and stirs the pot again in the same slow circles and tastes again, and this time she sets the spoon across the rim of the pot and nods slightly to herself, to no one, and goes back to her other work. This is also a kind of knowing, the knowing that comes not from measuring or calculating, but from tasting and adjusting, from years of doing this same thing, until the knowledge of it lives in the tongue and the nose and the hands, rather than in any set of instructions. She does not think about it consciously. The taste tells her what is needed, and her hand moves to the salt or the water or the herbs, and the adjustment is made, and then the pot is left to continue its slow work. The older child has been given tasks. There is water to carry from the well at the edge of the village, 2 trips with the wooden bucket, one hand holding the handle, the other steadying the bucket against the hip, and there is a pile of dried grass and rushes near the back of the house that need to be brought inside and spread near the wall, where they will dry further and eventually be used for bedding or for weaving or for tinder. The child goes about these tasks without complaint and without enthusiasm, in the equable way of a child who has been doing such things long enough that they have become simply the texture of the day rather than anything unusual. There is a kind of steadiness in this that is quieter and more lasting than any more dramatic feeling. The morning is tipping slowly toward midday. The light outside, already so gray and undramatic, has shifted in some subtle way that is more felt than seen, a slight lessening of the flatness, a very gentle warming of the air, as though the sun, still hidden behind its clouds, is making its presence known in the mildest possible way. Inside the house, the fire has settled into its working rhythm, not blazing but burning steadily, its heat no longer sharp and directional, but softer and more pervasive, filling the room in a way that makes it possible to be away from the immediate hearth without being cold. She has taken out a wooden board and set it on the low table, and on this board she has placed a few other things that will go into the evening meal, which is always the main meal of the day, the one that everyone eats together. There is a small piece of salt pork, not much, a few strips of it, pale and glistening, taken from a clay pot where it has been sitting in brine since the autumn, preserved against exactly this kind of need. Salt was a precious thing, and meat was preserved in it with care, and the salt pork that goes into the pot will not be the centerpiece of the meal, but more of a flavoring, something to deepen the taste of everything it cooks alongside, the way a good story is deepened by the things that are not said directly. There are also a few dried onions from the shelf, small, papery, their outer skins rustling when she handles them, and a handful of dried mushrooms, dark and wrinkled, gathered from the forest in early autumn, when they were plentiful and dried on wooden racks in the sun, now kept in a linen bag that hangs from a hook in the ceiling where the air is driest. She lifts the bag down and opens it and holds it near her nose for a moment, breathing in the smell of dried mushrooms, which is a deep, woody, slightly earthy smell that carries within it some echo of the forest, of damp leaf mold and dark soil, and the quiet underneath of trees. She shakes a small handful of the mushrooms into her palm, enough she judges by their weight and number and the way they fill her hand, and then ties the bag back up and hangs it again. She sets the dried mushrooms in a small clay bowl and pours a little warm water over them from the pot. Not much, just enough to cover them, and leaves them to soak on the edge of the hearth where the warmth will help them along. As they soak, they will soften and expand, the dried and shrunken flesh drawing in the water, swelling back towards something closer to what they were when fresh, though never quite that, always carrying the concentration and the intensity that comes from having been dried and then re-wetted. The soaking water itself will become deeply flavored, dark and rich and smelling of the forest, and she will use that too, pouring it carefully into the pot so as not to include any grit that might have settled at the bottom. The onions she peels slowly, sitting on a stool by the hearth. The papery outer layers come away in dry whispers, and underneath them the onion is firm and slightly yellowish, and when she cuts it on the wooden board with her short knife, the sharp, clean smell of raw onion rises in the warm air and makes her eyes water slightly, as it always does, and she blinks and goes on cutting, slicing each onion into thick pieces that will eventually become soft and sweet and nearly invisible in the long-cooked soup, present mostly as flavor, their texture dissolving into the broth over the hours of cooking. There is something meditative about this kind of food preparation, not the meditation of stillness exactly, but the meditation of slow, repetitive physical action, of a task that does not require thinking, and therefore leaves the mind free to wander or to rest, to be mostly empty. Peeling and cutting onions, stirring a pot, adjusting a piece of wood on the fire. These actions do not demand attention, not really. They ask only for the hands to be present, while the mind can float, half present and half somewhere else, neither fully asleep nor fully occupied, in a state that is restful in a way that pure idleness rarely is. She hums something to herself while she cuts the onions. It is not quite a song. It has no words, no clear melody, just a low, shapeless sound that rises and falls with her breath, a kind of unconscious accompaniment to the work of her hands. She does not seem to notice that she is doing it. The salt pork goes into the pot first, dropped in among the now well softened peas, where it will cook slowly and release its salt and its fat into the liquid, contributing a richness and a depth of flavor that neither the peas nor the water alone could provide. It sizzles very briefly when it hits the hot liquid, a short, sharp sound that fades immediately, and then it is simply in the pot, cooking slowly alongside everything else. Then the onions go in, and the mushrooms, drained from their soaking water, squeezed gently in her hand to remove most of it, then added to the pot, and the soaking water itself, poured in carefully, a thin, dark stream of it, fragrant and rich. The pot receives all of this and continues to simmer, drawing the flavors together, and the smell that rises from it now is richer and more complex than it was this morning. The earthiness of the peas, the saltiness of the pork, the sweet sharp note of the onion, and underneath everything the deep, woody fragrance of the mushrooms, all of it wrapped in smoke and heat, filling the room with the particular, unrepeatable smell of a particular meal being made on a particular day. Not much changes, and yet everything changes over the course of these hours. The afternoon arrives without ceremony. Outside, the clouds have shifted very slightly, and for a short time, a thin, watery sunlight touches the window and sends a weak, pale rectangle across the earth floor, which the smaller child sits in, looking down at the light on her hands, turning them over to see how the light changes. Then the clouds close again, and the pale rectangle disappears, and the floor is uniformly dim once more. The woman is outside for some of the afternoon. There are things to do in the small yard behind the house. The chickens need feeding, a scattering of cracked grain thrown in a wide arc across the cold earth, and there is wood to split for tomorrow's fire, swung with a short-handled axe in careful, practiced strokes that split each log cleanly along its grain. And the cold air after the warmth of the house is startling at first, sharp in the nostrils and on the exposed skin of the hands and face. The cold is not severe, not the deep cold of the worst winter days, but it is real and present, the kind of cold that reminds you of your body's edges, of where you end and the air begins. The breath rises in pale clouds with each exhale. She works quickly but not frantically, stacking the split wood in a pile near the door, where it will be sheltered from any rain or snow by the overhang of the roof. Her hands have done this work so many times that they know how to hold the axe, how to let the weight of the axe head do most of the work, when to let the swing carry through, and when to check it. The wood splits and falls, and she sets the next piece, and splits again, and the pile grows, and the cold works its way through the wool of her outer layer, and she notices it as a fact and not as a complaint. When she goes back inside, the warmth of the house closes around her immediately, the fire's heat meeting her at the door, and the smell from the pot, which has been cooking now for most of the day, slowly, patiently, without much attention, is fuller and richer than when she left, something that has settled and deepened in her absence, as though the pot has used the time of her being away to quietly complete some part of the work on its own. She stirs it. The liquid is noticeably thicker now, the peas almost entirely dissolved or broken down, their starch fully released into the broth, which has become a thick, smooth, dark golden soup, rich with the fat from the salt pork and the deep flavor of the mushrooms and the sweetness of the long-cooked onion. The pieces of salt pork are soft now, giving way easily when she presses the spoon against them, tender all the way through from the hours of slow cooking. She tastes and adds nothing because nothing is needed. This is one of the quietly remarkable things about the food of these older times, that it was made with very few ingredients, and that those ingredients were simple and plain and not particularly rare or special, and yet, cooked slowly over a fire, given time and heat and patience, they produced something that was deeply satisfying, deeply warming, something that tasted of itself in the way that simple good things taste, completely without distraction, without competing flavors or unnecessary complexity. A pot of peas cooked slowly with salt pork and onion and mushrooms and water and dried herbs over a wood fire for the better part of a day tastes exactly like what it is, and what it is a kind of warmth from the inside out, a kind of settling, a kind of arrival. The older child has come back inside and is sitting near the fire with a piece of cord and two small sticks, working at some private game or project, the tongue pressed slightly between the teeth in concentration. The younger child is asleep on the sleeping pallet, having fallen asleep in the late afternoon, as small children do, suddenly and completely, like a candle blown out, arms loose and face soft, and the chest rising and falling in the deep, uncomplicated rhythm of a child who has no trouble at all with the idea of rest. The room is warm and dim and quiet. The fire speaks in its low, continuous way, the small percussion of a log settling, the soft rush of a flame finding new wood, and the pot on the hearth simmers very gently, just at the edge of boiling, hardly even that, sending up small occasional bubbles that rise slowly to the surface and release a puff of steam that rises and spreads and vanishes. The room smells of everything it has smelled of all day, but concentrated now, deepened by hours. The smell of this home on this day, specific and warm and unrepeatable. The man returns as the light outside the window fades from the pale, flat gray of afternoon into the deeper, bluer gray of early evening. He comes in, bringing cold air and the smell of outdoors with him, the smell of turned earth and cold stone, and the particular winter afternoon smell that is really the smell of the absence of warmth, of air that has been in the open under a heavy sky all day, without any place to gather heat. He hangs his outer wrap on a wooden peg by the door and comes to the fire and stands close to it, holding his hands out, and the heat meets his cold hands and he sighs, not dramatically, not with any particular feeling, just the straightforward exhale of a person whose body has registered the contrast between outside and inside, and found the inside better. She brings out more bread, This is not the bread from yesterday's loaf, which has been used up through the day, but a new loaf that she baked in the latter part of the afternoon, in the time while the soup continued its slow work, and she had a few hours for other things. This bread was baked on the hearthstone, a thick, flat piece of sandstone that sits in the fire and holds heat exceptionally well, and it is a different bread from the sliced loaf of the morning. It is flatter, denser, made from the same rough grain flour but without the long rising time of a true loaf. More like a large, thick flatbread, cooked in the direct heat of the hearthstone beneath, and the fire's radiant heat from above, turned once in the middle of its cooking, when the bottom was set and the top was still soft. The result is a bread with a dark, slightly charred underside, not unpleasantly so, but with a distinct smokiness where the dough met the hot stone, and a top that is drier and more crust-like, and an interior that is dense and chewy and warm, still warm from the baking, smelling of toasted grain and fire and something faintly mineral from the stone it cooked on. She cuts it into wide triangular pieces with the same short-bladed knife, and the knife presses through the crust and then drags slightly through the denser interior, and the fresh bread gives off a new cloud of warm, grainy smell as the inside is exposed to the air. The evening meal is not a ceremony. There is no particular arrangement, no setting of the table in any formal sense. The wooden board is there, the clay cups are there, the bread is placed on a cloth in the middle of the table, and the pot is brought carefully from the fire and set on a folded piece of cloth on the table to protect the wood, and the soup is ladled out into clay bowls using a deep wooden ladle that has been darkened almost to black from years of contact with hot liquid and fire. Each bowl is filled slowly, the thick, fragrant soup pouring from the ladle in a deep golden brown stream, and the steam rises from each bowl in a soft, wavering column, and the mushroom and pea and salt pork smell of it rises into the air of the room and mixes with the smoke and the warmth into something that feels almost tangible, almost something you could reach out and hold. They eat. The soup is hot enough to require patience, and they hold the bowls in both hands and let the warmth transfer through the clay into their palms, and they blow on each spoonful, each carved wooden spoon, simple and smooth and slightly curved, and eat slowly and without conversation, mostly. There is the occasional word, a practical exchange, a brief question and a brief answer, and then silence again, the comfortable silence of people who have been together long enough that silence between them requires no filling, no explanation. The bread is torn into pieces and dipped into the soup, and the soup soaks into the bread and softens it, and the bread takes on the deep, savory, slightly salty flavor of the broth, and the combination of the soup and the bread together is more satisfying than either alone. The younger child wakes from the nap and comes to the table blinking and soft-faced, and is given a small bowl of the soup, thickened with a little more bread torn into tiny pieces, until it becomes almost a porridge, a thick and gentle thing that she eats carefully with a small spoon, one piece at a time, looking around the table with the clear, uncomplicated eyes of a child who is warm and fed and in the company of the people she knows best. Outside, the evening has fully arrived. The sky beyond the window, visible only as a small but dark square, has gone from gray to charcoal to near black, and the first cold of the night has settled into the air outside, though inside the house the fire still keeps it at bay. The warmth radiating out from the hearth in a steady, reliable way, reaching to every corner of the small room, though softening slightly by the time it reaches the walls. The world outside is quiet, genuinely quiet, in the way that a world without electrical light and without engines becomes quiet at night. A darkness and a silence that are complete and deep, broken only by the sounds of animals and wind and occasionally a human voice somewhere in the village, muffled by walls and distance into something soft and indistinct. They eat until the soup is finished, or nearly so. The bowls are not scraped completely clean, but they are eaten thoroughly, the bread used at the end to wipe up what the spoon could not reach, because this is what is done, because nothing is wasted, because the making of a meal is a long, patient act, and the eating of it should be in some way equal to that, a kind of completeness, an arrival at the end of a process that began with dried peas soaking in a pot of cold water in the early morning. The fire is tended for the night. This is a careful act, deliberate and unhurried. She adds the largest logs, the ones that were kept to the side for this purpose, heavier and denser than the rest, the kind of wood that burns slowly and holds heat for a long time, and arranges them on the hearth in a way that will allow them to catch fully and then burn down steadily through the night. She rakes the coals to the center and surrounds them with ash, which insulates the coals and slows their burning, letting them breathe slowly for the hours of darkness, so that in the morning, when she comes to the hearth again, there will be something to work with. Not a roaring fire, but the possibility of one, the coal and the ash and the warmth still there, waiting. The clay pots are put back on the shelf. The wooden spoons are rinsed in a little water and set near the fire to dry. The leftover soup, there is some, perhaps a cup or two at the bottom of the pot, grown thick and slightly gelatinous as it cools. The starch in the peas thickening it further, is covered with a piece of cloth and left near the hearth, where the residual warmth will keep it from going bad overnight, and where it will be reheated in the morning, thinned with a little water, and eaten again, tasting perhaps slightly different the second day, the flavors having had the night to continue their slow conversation. This is the other thing about food cooked this way, in these slow fire quantities, in these simple pots, that it is often better the next day than the first, as though the overnight rest allows something to settle and deepen and become more fully itself. The cold does not hurt it. The reheating enriches it slightly differently. The meal eaten the next morning from the night before's pot is a continuation, a second chapter, and it tastes of time in a way that only slow-cooked things can taste. The children are put to bed, the smaller one first. She is already drowsy again, the day and the meal having settled into her with their full weight. And then the older one, who asks a question about something and receives a quiet answer and is satisfied and goes to sleep. The house is very still. The fire breathes in the hearth. The coals settle once, making a small, dry, papery sound, and then settle into their long, slow burn of the night. The man and woman sit for a while near the fire, not doing very much. He is working slowly at something in his hands, a piece of leather or rope, some small repair, and she is spinning, drawing out the wool from a bundled mass of it and twisting it onto a wooden spindle that hangs and turns from the thread, the weight of the spindle keeping the tension in the thread as it forms. The spinning makes a very soft, almost inaudible sound, the whisper of the wool being drawn thin between her fingers, the faint turning of the spindle, and the firelight catches the thread as it forms, making it briefly visible before it winds onto the spindle and becomes part of the growing mass of spun fiber there. She has been doing this for so many years that her hands do it without thought, and her eyes rest on the fire rather than on her work, and her mind is quiet as the room, as quiet as the night outside. The fire says what it says, that there is warmth here, that there has been a day, that the day has been completed in the only way a day can be completed, by living through it from one end to the other, doing the things that needed doing, making the meal, tending the fire, carrying the water, breaking and eating the bread. Not much changes as the night deepens. The fire burns lower. The room cools a little at its edges, though the center near the hearth remains warm. The spindle slows and stops as she sets it down and stretches her hands, opening and closing the fingers that have been working all day. He sets aside whatever he was repairing. They exchange a few low words, very quiet, and then they too go to the sleeping pallets, and the blankets are pulled up, and the room is left to the fire, and the quiet and the smell of the spent day, the wood smoke, the cooked peas, the bread, the faint mineral tang of the hearthstone, the wool, the earth floor, the cold at the edges of the walls, all of it mixing together in the darkness into something that is the smell of this particular house on this particular night, something that has been true of this room every night for many years, something that will continue to be true long after this particular night has ended. The pot on the hearth cools slowly. The soup inside it settles and thickens in the dark, and the thin skin of heat that surrounds the cooking pot cools degree by degree, and the coals in the hearth pull back into themselves, the orange deepening to red, the red dimming toward a dusky rust that pulses faintly in the dark room like something breathing, something alive, patient, and steady. It is, in its way, enough. And now let us slow down even further and stay in this place for a while longer, because there is more to be noticed here, more texture and detail in this ordinary day, more quiet beauty in the plain act of feeding people from a fire-warmed pot. Let us begin again, or rather, let us linger the way the smell of a wood fire lingers long after the fire has burned down, present in the walls and the cloth and the hair, in everything that the smoke has touched and warmed. The grain that went into that bread, let us think for a moment about where it came from, about the long, patient story that brought it to the wooden shelf in this small stone house on this particular day. It was grown in a field not far from the village, a field that has been plowed and planted and harvested for generations, its soil worn and worked and replenished with ash and animal dung and the organic matter of everything that has ever lived and died in it. The grain was planted in the spring, rye most likely, in this kind of climate, or a mixture of rye and barley, grains that are tolerant of cold and wet, that do not require the warmth of sunnier climates, that grow low and dense and golden brown in the late summer fields. It was harvested in late summer with bladed tools, cut near the ground and bundled and stacked to dry, and then threshed, beaten against a stone or a wooden frame to knock the grain from its stalks, and the grain was gathered and stored in a dry place, in sacks or clay vessels, away from the moisture that would encourage mold, and away from the animals that would eat it given any chance. The milling of it happened in the village or nearby, at a mill that used the turning of a stone, driven by water, or by a donkey walking in a circle, depending on the mill and the season and the need, to grind the dried grain between two heavy stones. The grinding produced flour, and the flour that came from these older mills was not the fine, white, sieved flour of much later times, but something coarser, something that still carried within it fragments of the bran and the germ, the outer parts of the grain that were rich in flavor and nutrition, but also darker in color and slightly bitter at the edges. This flour, mixed with water and a small amount of leaven, a piece of old dough kept from the last baking, carrying within it the yeasts that had built up over weeks and months of use, and then shaped and left to rise slowly, and baked in whatever heat was available, became the bread of this household, this morning's bread, yesterday's bread, the bread of every morning for as long as this house has stood. The peas, too, have their history. They were grown in the kitchen garden, a small plot just behind the house, and dried at the end of summer in the sun on a flat stone, then kept in their clay pot through the autumn and into the winter. Dried peas were a staple of this kind of life in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate from the comfortable distance of the present. They were protein and substance, and filling in a way that very few other things could be during the long months when fresh food was scarce. They could be kept for months, or even years without spoiling. They could be cooked in almost any way, boiled simply in water, mashed with fat, combined with any scraps of meat or vegetable that were available, and they would always produce something warming and substantial, always repay their cooking with nourishment. The salt pork came from a pig that was kept through the summer and autumn and slaughtered in the early winter, in the time of year when the cold would help preserve the meat, when the work of slaughtering and salting and hanging could be done in the frosty air of a November morning. The slaughter of the pig was not a sorrowful event exactly, though neither was it without weight. It was simply a necessary part of the rhythm of the year, the moment when a year's worth of care and feeding became the year's worth of meat that would carry the household through the cold months. Every part of the animal was used. The fat was rendered for cooking, and for making candles, and for preserving other things. The organs were eaten in the days immediately following the slaughter, before they could spoil. The intestines were cleaned and used as casings for sausages. The feet and ears and snout were simmered slowly into a gel of cartilage and flavor, and the belly and the back were salted, rubbed thoroughly with coarse salt, packed in brine in clay vessels sealed with cloth and weight, where they would keep for months, slowly curing, becoming salt pork, becoming the strips of pale, firm, deeply flavored meat that went into this morning's pot and cooked down through the long day into the meal that was eaten this evening by firelight. The mushrooms came from the forest that begins at the edge of the village and stretches for miles in every direction, a mixed forest of oak and beech and birch, and in the lower and wetter places, alder and willow. A forest that is dark and quiet and full of things that grow in the shadows of the big trees, on the forest floor, in the soft duff of dead leaves, on the sides of fallen logs. In early autumn, the mushrooms appear in the forest in abundance, round-capped and brown, emerging from the damp earth in overnight profusions after the first heavy rains of the season, fruiting bodies of the underground networks of fungal threads that run through the forest soil in all directions, connecting tree to tree in a slow, old chemistry. The gathering of mushrooms was something that required knowledge, the knowledge of which kinds were edible and which were not, knowledge that was passed from older people to younger, tested carefully, never assumed. But once learned, it was a reliable knowledge, consistent year to year, because the mushrooms themselves were consistent, appearing in the same places, on the same logs, under the same trees, season after season, with a steadiness that made them almost a part of the landscape's agreement with the people who lived near it. Dried mushrooms, packed in a linen bag and hung from the ceiling in the driest part of the house, would last through winter and into spring, and they would carry with them, long after the freshness of autumn had faded, something of the forest's deep flavor, something woody and earthy and complex that no other ingredient could quite replicate, that made every soup and stew they entered just slightly richer, just slightly more complete. There is something worth pausing on here in this description of dried mushrooms and salted pork and rough-milled grain flour and dried peas. The extraordinary amount of work that surrounded every ingredient on this table, the enormous quiet labor of growing and harvesting and storing and preserving, the months and months of preparation that preceded every single bowl of soup, to grow the peas, to harvest them, to dry them, to store them, to plant the grain, to harvest it, to thresh it, to carry it to the mill, to mill it, to carry the flour home, to make the leaven, to bake the bread, to keep the pig, to slaughter it, to salt it, to store it through the months, to gather the mushrooms in the forest, to carry them home, to dry them, to pack them, to keep them dry through the damp winter months. Each of these was a chain of careful, skilled, patient labor, most of it performed by ordinary people who had no choice but to be skilled at it, who could not afford the failures that come from not paying attention. And when the bowl of soup was ladled out in the evening and eaten by firelight, It carried within it all of that labor, all of that time, all of that care, even though the eating of it was simple and unremarkable, just people feeding themselves from what they had made and stored and cooked. The simplicity of the eating was made possible by the complexity of the getting ready, and that complexity was invisible by the time the food was on the table, as invisible as the roots of a tree are invisible in the soil while the tree is flowering above. Slowly, let us return to the house and the fire and the people who are sleeping now, and let us sit quietly in this room for a while longer. The fire in the hearth has burned down to a deep, glowing mass of coals, and the coals have a color that is hard to describe precisely. Not quite orange, not quite red, something between the two. A deep ember color that pulses very slowly, almost imperceptibly, as the air moves through the room in small, lazy currents. The light this gives is very dim, more orange than light, more warmth than illumination, and it falls on the sleeping shapes under their blankets in a way that makes them look very still and very peaceful. The small movements of breathing, the only thing that distinguishes them from the rest of the quiet room. The soup pot sits on the edge of the hearth, off the direct fire now, but still warm enough that if you were to put your hand near it, you would feel a gentle heat radiating from the clay. The thickened soup inside it has gone quite still and dense as the temperature has dropped through the last hours, the surface gone from a slow simmer to utter stillness, and in the dim coal light you can see the surface of it, dark and glossy and smooth, reflecting the faint pulse of the coals as a tiny blurred orange glow. Outside, the village is completely quiet now. Whatever sounds the evening had, the occasional distant voice, the movement of an animal, the creaking of wood in the cold, have subsided into a silence that is almost complete, almost absolute, broken only by the wind moving occasionally through the trees beyond the village, a soft and continuous sound that has no beginning and no end, that simply exists in the way that all large, gentle things exist, as a condition rather than an event. The cold outside is deepening toward the coldest part of the night, the hours before dawn, and the frost is forming on the ground, on the grass, on the stones of the yard behind the house, on the split wood in the woodpile, covering everything in a thin, bright layer of crystals that the next morning will catch the first light and sparkle briefly before the day warms enough to melt them. But in this room, the fire still gives enough warmth to keep the cold at bay, and the thick stone walls hold it in, and the breathing of the people sleeping here is warm and steady, and the room, for all its simplicity, is a good place to be. In the morning she will wake again, and she will come to the fire again, and she will find the coals still warm and patient, and she will rebuild the fire in exactly the way she rebuilt it this morning. The same motions, the same sequence, the same quiet waiting for the first small flame to catch and grow. She will put the leftover soup on to reheat, thinned with a little water, and she will cut more bread. There is still some, the flatbread from last evening, and perhaps she will make more, and the day will begin again in the same way that today began, with the same smells and the same textures and the same simple sequence of tasks, and there will be nothing remarkable about any of it, and that is the point. Let us think for a moment about what the word staple means, the way it has been used for so long to describe foods like bread and peas and salt pork, foods that are not luxuries, not special occasion foods, not delicacies, but the daily ground of eating, the foundation on which all other food rests, or from which it departs. The word staple comes from old words meaning a post, a pillar, something driven into the earth or wall that holds other things in place. And that is exactly what these foods were, the structural elements of nourishment in a world where food was not guaranteed, where the seasons and the weather and the soil determined what was possible and what was not, where the difference between enough and not enough was a real and present concern for most people most of the time. Dried peas and beans kept people alive through winters, when fresh food had been exhausted and the spring was still weeks away. Salt pork and dried fish provided protein in the months when no animals could be slaughtered without depleting next year's stock. Bread, coarse and heavy as it was, provided calories in quantity, the dense, slow-burning energy that a person needed to carry water and split wood and plow a field in the cold. These were not glamorous foods, and they were not intended to be. They were intended to be reliable, to be there, to be made from what was available, to sustain the body for the work that the body had to do. And in being made and eaten day after day, year after year, they became part of the very texture of life, inseparable from it, as fundamental to the experience of living as the turning of the seasons or the passage from morning to night. The smell of bread baking was not a special smell. It was the smell of a morning, of being alive, of the day having the resources it needed to proceed. The warmth of a bowl of soup held in both hands was not a luxury sensation. It was simply what warmth felt like, what being fed felt like, what the word enough felt like when it was translated from abstract concept into direct physical experience. There is something worth sitting with in that. The notion that what we now might call comfort food was simply food, that what we now experience as nostalgia, the evocative warmth of simple, slowly cooked things, the smell of bread and fire, the density of a thick, plainly seasoned stew, was for most of human history simply life, simply Tuesday, simply the daily fact of being alive in a body that needed to eat and being in possession of the means to provide for that need. The comfort was real, the warmth was real, but it was not exceptional. It was ordinary. And the ordinary is its own kind of wealth. The night is very deep now. The cold outside the walls has reached its fullest depth, and the stars, if anyone were outside to see them, would be very bright in the clear dark above the clouds that have thinned and parted in the late night hours, and the frost would be settling on every horizontal surface, and the whole village would be dark and still, just the shapes of the buildings against the sky, and the occasional glow from a hearth showing through a crack in a shutter or a gap around a door, and the great darkness of the fields beyond the village, and the greater darkness of the forest beyond the fields, all of it quiet and cold and under the same still sky. Inside the house, The fire sleeps in its careful way. The breathing of the 4 people in the room is soft and steady and regular, each breath a small exhale of warmth into the dimly glowing dark, each breath a continuation. The bread on the shelf, there is still a little of the flatbread left, wrapped in cloth, will be there in the morning, slightly harder and drier than it was this evening, as bread always is on the day after baking, and it will be eaten and it will be fine. Let us linger here a little longer, in this warm room, in this slow quiet. Let us not rush toward morning. The fire, even now, even at its late night low, produces something that we might think of as its own kind of music. Not music exactly. It has no rhythm in the formal sense, no pattern that repeats precisely, but a sound environment, a continuous layering of very small sounds that together produce something richer than any single one of them. There is the low exhale of combustion, barely audible, more felt in the warmth of the air than heard. There is the very occasional settling of a log, a small dry collapse of charred wood that makes a soft, fibrous sound and sends a brief shower of tiny orange sparks upward, which float for a moment and then wink out in the cooler air above the hearth. There is now and then a faint crackling at the edge of a log where the wood is still dry enough to speak, a stuttering, papery sound that lasts only a second or two and then subsides. And there is the silence that fills between these sounds, a silence that is not empty but full, full of the warmth, the dim light, the smell of smoke and old food and earth, the steady, unconscious breathing of the sleeping family. This is the sound of a house being kept, of warmth being maintained through the night by the patient work of a fire that was built and tended by human hands and is now burning on its own, doing its part, carrying its share of the work of keeping everyone alive through the cold hours. In the quiet, let us not rush toward morning, thinking about the fire just for a moment, thinking about what it means, practically and plainly, to cook over fire, to do this the primary and only method of cooking available, as it was for essentially all of human history until the relatively recent past. Fire is not a controllable heat, not in the way that a modern stove is controllable. It cannot be turned down with a dial or raised with a push of a button. It has its own rhythms, its own moods, affected by the kind of wood being burned and the dryness of that wood and the direction of the draft and the weather outside and the size and arrangement of the logs. The cook learns to read the fire, to understand the difference between a high, bright, busy fire that is better for quick cooking and a low, steady, banking fire that is better for long, slow simmering. The position of the pot over the fire, closer to the center of the heat for a more aggressive simmer, pulled to the edge for a gentler warmth, is a constant adjustment, a conversation between the cook and the flame. And the kinds of food that suit this kind of cooking are, not coincidentally, exactly the kinds of food that fill this pot tonight. Long cooking, patient dishes, things that are improved rather than damaged by hours of slow heat, that become more themselves rather than less as the time goes on. Soups, stews, porridges, braised things, slow roasted things, things packed with ingredients that need time to give up their flavors, to soften, to merge, to become more than the sum of their parts. These are the dishes of fire cookery, and they are also, not coincidentally, the dishes of the cold months, of the months when the fire is always burning anyway, when the room needs the fire's heat, regardless of whether cooking is happening, when the pot may as well be on the fire all day, because the fire is going to burn all day, whether or not the pot is there. There is an efficiency to this that is beautiful in its plain logic. The fire that heats the room also cooks the food. The pot that warms in the morning also holds the evening meal. The ash from yesterday's wood is saved for today's soap or tomorrow's garden. The water that soaks the dried mushrooms becomes part of the broth. The leftover soup becomes tomorrow's breakfast. Nothing stands alone. Everything is part of a connected, circular logic of use and reuse and use again, a logic that has nothing to do with ideology or principle and everything to do with the simple fact that waste was something that people living close to the margin of sufficiency could not afford, and so they had learned, over generations, to eliminate it not by effort or willpower, but by the design of their daily practice. The clay pots on the shelf have been in this household for many years, some of them. They were made by a potter in the village or in a nearby village, shaped on a wheel or by hand from local clay, fired in a kiln or sometimes simply in an open fire, glazed in some cases with a simple lead or ash glaze that made them less porous and easier to clean, left unglazed in others, where the porosity of the clay was actually useful, for storing vegetables, for example, where the slight exchange of air through the clay helped regulate moisture and kept the contents from rotting too quickly. They are not beautiful objects, these pots, not in any decorated or refined sense. They are functional objects, made to hold things, to be easy to carry, to survive the knocks and bumps of daily use, to be replaced when they crack or break, without any great loss. And yet they have their own kind of beauty, the beauty of things that are exactly suited to their purpose, that have the exact shape and thickness and weight that their use requires, no more, no less, no unnecessary flourish, no wasted material. The wooden spoons, the wooden board, the knife with its worn wooden handle, all of these are the same, made to be used, shaped by use, showing in their wear and their darkening and their small imperfections the history of every meal they have helped prepare, every pot they have stirred, every loaf they have cut, every hand that has held them. In the quiet, let us simply sit with these objects for a moment. The clay pot with the cracked lip that holds the dried peas. The iron hook on which the cooking pot hangs, worn smooth where the pot's ring rests against it, darker than the rest of the hook from years of heat. The flat hearthstone on which the bread was baked, its surface blackened and seasoned and smooth in the center from all that contact with fire and dough, rougher at its edges where it meets the stone and ash of the hearths around. The wooden stool near the fire, its legs slightly uneven, compensated for by a piece of wood wedged under one leg, not a repair exactly, just an accommodation, a practical solution arrived at without fuss. All of these things are simply here, in the room, doing what they do, having been used, and will be used again. The fire breathes. The coals are orange and patient in the dark room. Outside, the frost deepens on the grass and on the stones and on the woodpile, and the stars wheel very slowly overhead in their old, unhurried arcs, and the forest at the edge of the fields stands dark and still and full of its own slow life. The owls hunting in the field margins, the small animals in their burrows, the mushroom threads in the soil continuing their slow work, even in the cold, the trees standing in the dark, with their roots deep in the earth, absorbing the night the way they absorb all things, patiently, thoroughly, without comment. The night continues, and somewhere between where you are now, reading or listening to these words, in whatever comfortable and warm place you are, and the quiet of this stone house with its fire and its soup and its sleeping family, somewhere between these two very different places in time, all of those generations of people with their daily fires and their clay pots and their rough bread and their patient soups have lived and cooked and eaten and slept and woken and begun again, uncountably many of them, most of them unknown, most of their lives undocumented, most of their meals unremarked upon and unremembered, but all of them continuous with one another in an unbroken chain of daily fire making and daily bread baking and daily pot stirring that runs from somewhere very deep in the past right up to the kitchen in which someone not so very long ago did something that would have looked entirely familiar to the woman tending her hearth in this small stone house, something as plain and as fundamental as putting something in a pot and setting it over heat and waiting. Not much changes, and yet everything changes over the course of all those years. The fire is the same, the hunger is the same, the warmth of the soup and the smell of the bread are the same. The particular pleasure of a hot meal at the end of a cold day is the same, whether it is eaten by firelight from a clay bowl or under electric light from a ceramic plate. What changes are the details, the ingredients, the tools, the fuel, the setting, but the deeper thing, the warmth seeking, the eating together, the smell of something simple and good being slowly made over a sustained heat, the satisfaction of a meal that was prepared with patience and care and eaten in the company of others. This has not changed at all, and perhaps will not. And perhaps that is why this kind of evening, a fire, a pot, a simple meal, a quiet house, still carries the weight it does, still produces in us, when we encounter it in the imagination or in life, that particular feeling of arrival, of settling, of something deep in the body recognizing a condition it has been seeking. Let the room be quiet now. Let the fire do its slow, patient work. Let the soup in the pot finish its cooling into the thick, dark golden stillness it will rest in until morning. Let the coals dim from their deep orange toward the rust and gray of true dormancy, that state of suspended warmth in which they will hold what they have through the night and offer it again in the morning when they are needed. Let the house be still, the people in it sleep deeply in the way that people sleep when they have been warm and fed and have done the work of the day completely, the long sleep of physical tiredness that is one of the quieter gifts of a life lived close to its own most basic requirements. There is no racing in their sleep, no restlessness. Their bodies are doing what bodies do after cold and labor and warm food and the heat of a fire. They are resting very thoroughly, recovering very completely, gathering themselves for the morning. It will be the same morning, more or less. The same fire to rebuild, the same pot to fill, the same bread to cut, the same day to begin. And that sameness is a good thing. That sameness is the ground on which a life is built, the daily repetition of the fundamental tasks of staying alive and keeping others alive, the quiet and uncelebrated labor of continuity. The bread on the shelf rests under its cloth. The dried peas in their clay pot wait in their quiet way. The salt pork in its brine vessel keeps its slow chemistry. The dried herbs in their bag contribute their faint, faraway smell of summer to the room. And the fire keeps its patient, orange vigil in the dark, small but sufficient, alive. Everything is in order. Everything that needs to be here is here. The day has been completed in the only way that matters, by lasting through it, by feeding everyone who needed feeding, by keeping the fire alive, by making the meal, by eating it together, by being here in this warm place at the end of the day. Let your breath slow now. Let the sounds of this room, the fire, the sleeping breath, the faint wind beyond the thick stone walls, become the sounds that accompany you as you drift toward wherever you are going. The night is long and dark and cold and full of stars beyond the cloud. The fire breathes. The pot on the hearth holds what remains of the day's cooking in its thick, dark embrace, patient and warm and still. Not much changes. The fire burns. The house is warm. Slowly, the night continues. Gently, the dark goes on. And somewhere, always, a fire is being tended. A pot is on the heat. Bread is being made from grain and water and time. And someone is sitting very close to the warmth of the flame, doing nothing in particular, simply being present in the same way the fire is present. Steady, low, patient, sufficient here, sleep well. Let us also think, quietly, about the grain in the mill and what happens between the field and the bread, because this too is part of the long patience that produces a loaf. The grain was harvested in high summer, in the warm weeks when the stalks had dried and the heads bowed with their weight of ripe grain, and the cutting was done with curved blades, bent low in the long rows, gathering the stalks in one arm and cutting through them near the base with the other hand, and the cut grain was bundled and tied and stacked in the field to finish drying in the sun. This was work for many hands, the kind of work that pulled a whole village into the fields, because the window for harvest is short and the weather unpredictable, and grain that is not brought in before the rains come may be lost. And lost grain in this kind of world is a serious thing, a consequence that ripples through the whole year. After the drying came the threshing, the separating of the grain from the stalks, which was done by beating the bundles against a smooth stone or a wooden hurdle, or by laying them on a hard floor and beating them with jointed wooden flails, 2 pieces of wood connected by a short length of leather or rope, swung in an arc over the head and brought down hard on the grain, again and again, the rhythm steady and hard and repetitive, until the grain had loosened from the heads and fallen to the floor. And then the winnowing, the tossing of the threshed grain into the air on a breezy day, so that the lighter chaff, the papery hulls and broken stalks and dust, would blow away while the heavier grain fell back down, slightly cleaner, slightly purer, ready to be collected and stored. The storing was in a dry place, in sacks made of rough linen or in clay vessels sealed with wooden lids or cloth tied with cord, and the grain would keep for months in this form, waiting for the milling. The mill itself was a stone building near the water, if there was water sufficient to drive the wheel, or sometimes on a hill where the wind was reliable enough to turn a set of sails. Inside the mill, the grain was fed between two heavy circular stones, the lower one fixed, the upper one turning, and ground down into flour, the stones turning slowly, the grain crushed and broken and reduced progressively as it worked its way from the center to the edge between the two moving surfaces. And what came out was flour, coarse and gray-brown, and warm from the friction of the stones, smelling of grain and dust and something slightly mineral, slightly earthy. This flour was taken home in sacks over the shoulder or in a cart and stored in a dry vessel and used as the household needed it, a cupful at a time, mixed with water from the well and a small piece of the kept leaven, that living piece of old dough, sour and yeasty and complex, maintained carefully from baking to baking, and kneaded until smooth and left to rise in the warmth near the fire, and then shaped into a loaf or a flat round, and baked on the hearthstone or in a clay vessel placed in the embers. And the result was bread, the daily bread, the bread that tastes of everything it went through to become what it is. To eat bread made this way, made from grain grown in a known field, ground at a known mill, leavened with a leaven that has been kept alive for months, baked on a stone that is warm from a fire of known wood, is to eat something that is deeply embedded in a place and a time. Every ingredient in it is local in the most literal sense, local to this soil, this water, this air, this particular corner of the world. The bread tastes of where it was made, not in any romantic or exaggerated way, but in the simple, direct way that things taste of their actual material constituents. The grain grew in that field. The water came from that well. The leaven grew from wild yeasts that live in this particular air. The fire was made from wood cut from those particular trees. The bread is, in this sense, a very specific thing, connected at every point to the place that produced it. And the eating of it, tearing off a piece and dipping it into the thick, dark soup, completes a circuit that began with the planting of the grain and the tending of the pig and the gathering of the mushrooms and the drying of the peas and the cutting of the wood for the fire. Each mouthful is the end of a very long story, a story that has been quietly unfolding all year and all the years before, and the person eating it may not be thinking about any of this, is probably not thinking about any of this, is probably just eating because they are hungry, and the food is good, and the room is warm, and there is no reason to think about anything in particular at all. And that is exactly as it should be. The warmth of the house deepens as the night goes on, in the way that the warmth of a well-tended fire deepens as the heat spreads slowly through the thick stone walls, and the walls give it back gradually, the stone becoming a second source of warmth, radiating from every surface the heat it absorbed during the day and the evening, and the room reaching a kind of thermal equilibrium where the fire and the walls together maintain a temperature that is comfortable and steady, even as the cold outside deepens. This is one of the properties of stone as a building material that the people who built with it understood very well. That stone is slow. It is slow to heat and slow to cool, which means it acts as a buffer against the extremes of outside temperature, absorbing the day's heat and releasing it through the night, moderating the swings between warm and cold in a way that a thinner or less thermally massive material would not. The same walls that feel cold to the touch when the fire has only just been lit will feel warm by mid-evening, warm through the whole night, and still retaining some of that warmth in the early morning when the fire is being rebuilt from the night's coals. The house works with the fire, not just as a shelter against the wind, but as an active participant in the keeping of warmth, a slow, massive, patient partner to the quick, bright energy of the flame. In the quiet dark of the sleeping house, all of this is simply happening without anyone directing it, without anyone being aware of it. The walls hold the warmth. The fire breathes low. The soup in its pot cools toward the temperature of the room, settling into its thick stillness. The people in their blankets sleep the deep, thorough sleep of people who have been warm and fed and physically tired in an uncomplicated way, and the night passes over them hour by hour without disturbing them. Not much changes. The coals in the hearth shift slightly once, a soft, small sound in the silence. The wind moves in the trees beyond the village, and a branch touches another branch and is still. A small animal in the thatch above the ceiling moves and then is quiet. The stars continue their slow wheel above the clouds, and slowly, infinitely slowly, the darkness begins to thin. It is not yet dawn. It is far from dawn, but somewhere in the deepest part of the night, the balance begins to tip, so slightly that no one could notice it, except perhaps a person who had been awake all night and watching the sky, and even then they would not be certain, but only suspect. The darkness is still complete, still total in the way only a night without artificial light can be total. But something in the quality of the cold has changed, or perhaps it is the cold itself that has reached its deepest point and begun its slow retreat, and the night, having accomplished the coldest part of what it came to do, is beginning, very, very gradually, to prepare for the idea of morning. This is the turning point that comes every night, in every season, in every year that has ever been. The deepest cold before the first relenting, the last full dark before the first tentative gray. It is a moment that passes unwitnessed almost always, because almost everyone is asleep for it, and yet it happens without fail, with the same patient reliability as everything else in the cycle of a day. And in some sense, it is the most important moment, because it is the point from which everything else in the morning proceeds. The woman in her blankets does not know consciously that this moment has passed, but something in her body registers it. The very slight lessening of the cold, perhaps, or some internal clock that has been wound by years of waking at the same time, and she shifts in her sleep, turning slightly, pulling the blanket closer, and sighs once and settles again. The fire holds its coals. There is a particular smell that a room has in the very deep part of the night, different from the smell it had in the evening, and different from the smell it will have in the morning. The food smells have faded to almost nothing. The soup and the bread are present only as the very faint residue of themselves, a ghost of the evening's richness, a memory of warmth. The wood smoke is there, always, embedded in everything. The walls, the blankets, the clothes on the pegs, the thatch above, the hair of the sleeping people, everything permeated with the slow, quiet accumulation of smoke that has been building in this room since the day the house was first used and the first fire was lit on this hearth. But even the smoke smell is muted now, absorbed background, no longer distinct from the smell of the room itself. And underneath all of this is the smell of the earth floor, damp in its deep layers and cold, pressing up a faint mineral coldness through the packed surface, and the smell of the stone walls, which have their own smell, something gray and ancient, the smell of compressed geological time. This is the smell of the house at its most private, at the bottom of its nightly self. By morning it will smell of the fire being rebuilt, and the pot being reheated, and the bread being cut, and the family waking and moving and breathing and beginning the day. But now it smells of nothing happening at all, or rather, of everything having already happened and not yet having begun again, the long pause between one day's ending and the next day's beginning. Not much changes. The quiet holds. Let us stay a little while in this quiet, because it is a good place to be. This quiet between things, this pause in the rhythm of the day. The world outside is dark and cold and still and vast, and inside this small stone room there is warmth and breath, and the low pulse of firelight, and the soup in the pot, and the bread under the cloth, and the salt pork in its brine, and the dried peas in their clay vessel, and the mushrooms in their bag, and the salt in its small pot near the hearth, are all simply there, quietly present, waiting without any impatience to be used again in the morning, in exactly the same way they were used today, because that is what they are, and that is what they are for. This is perhaps the most fundamental thing about food in this kind of life, that it is never really finished. There is no meal that stands alone, complete in itself, sealed off from what came before and what comes after. Every meal is part of a longer story, connected backward in time to the sowing and growing and harvesting and storing and preserving that preceded it, and connected forward to the next meal that will be made from what remains, and the meal after that, all of it continuous, all of it part of the same slow unfolding, the same patient working through the year's provisions, careful and steady and unceasing. The leftover soup in the pot is tomorrow's breakfast, and the grain in the sack will be tomorrow's bread, and the salt pork in its brine vessel will be next week's flavoring, and the dried peas in their clay pot are perhaps a third of the supply that will last until spring, and all of it is held in mind not as a calculation or an anxiety, but as a quiet knowledge, a background awareness of where things stand, of what is plentiful and what needs to be used carefully. This is the original relationship between people and food, not abundance without thought, but sufficiency with attention, not plenty without care, but enough carefully kept and wisely used. There is a steadiness to this that runs all the way through the simplest acts of the day, the way the salt is pinched from the pot, the way the dried herbs are taken in a small amount rather than a large one, the way the water that soaked the mushrooms is saved and used, a steadiness that is not anxious or calculating, but simply consistent, the expression of a deeply ingrained understanding of the relationship between what you have and what you need and what you can keep for later. And this steadiness is itself a kind of nourishment in a way that is perhaps harder to name than the nourishment of the soup, but no less real. The nourishment of a life that has a reliable structure, that follows a pattern, that knows roughly what tomorrow will look like, because tomorrow will look like today, which looked like yesterday, and all the days before that in a long, unbroken chain of mornings, and fires, and water carried from wells, and bread made from the same grain, in the same way with the same hands. Not much changes. The deep quiet holds. The room breathes with its sleeping family. And somewhere outside, the first birds are beginning, not singing yet, just beginning to stir in the thatch and the hedges and the low branches of the trees nearest the village, shifting and rustling and making the small preparatory sounds of creatures about to begin their day, small sounds that are still more like waking than like living, but that carry in them the first intimation of morning, the very first announcement that the night, however long and dark and cold, is not permanent, is in fact already ending, has been ending for the last few hours in its gradual, patient way, and that the day is coming back, the same as it always comes back, with its light and its tasks, and its fire to be rebuilt, and its pot to be filled, and its bread to be made, and all of it waiting quietly in the future tense of what is about to happen, warm and ordinary and necessary and enough. The fire in the hearth stirs very slightly, as though it too is making some small preparation for what comes next. One coal at the edge of the pile brightens briefly, pulses once with a slightly stronger orange, and then settles back. The room holds its warmth and its darkness a little longer, and slowly, in its own time, without any hurrying, without any announcement, the first pale suggestion of light begins to find its way through the thin gap between the shutter and the stone of the window frame. A line of slightly less dark, barely perceptible, the first faint breath of the coming day feeling its way into the room that has been dark all night. She will wake soon. She will come to the fire and kneel on the earth floor and begin to rebuild it from the patient coals, and the thin wood will catch, and the flame will grow, and the pot will be lifted onto its hook, and the water will go in, and the leftover soup will go in, and the warmth will build, and the room will fill again with all the smells of the morning. And the bread will be cut, and the day will begin again, steady and ordinary and continuous. But for this last moment, the room is still. The fire breathes. The cold outside has begun its slow retreat. The darkness is already, though you would never quite be certain of it, very slightly less absolute than it was an hour ago. Not much changes, and everything is in order. Sleep well.